I do have a couple of comments to make concerning the remarks by my good friend from Vermont, but I will do that at the conclusion of another subject that I feel some passion about, and that has to do with the nomination of Harold Koh by President Obama. He is a nominee for the position of legal advisor to the State Department, and I understand that cloture has been filed on Harold Koh, and I wanted to come to register my strong opposition and assure the American people that their representatives in Congress are not going to let this nominee sail through unopposed, and to let them know that there are some of us here in the Senate who will require full and extensive debate before this nominee receives a vote. And I think that in doing so, you almost have to ask the question as to whatever happened to the understanding we've always had in this country as to what sovereignty really means. As legal advisor to the State Department, Koh would be advising the Secretary of State on the legality of United States action in the international forum and interpreting and advocating for the international law and treaties. Now, the significance of this position and its effect on our sovereignty and security shouldn't be understated. Koh is a self-proclaimed transnationalist, adheres to this school of thought, believes that international law is equal to or should take precedent over domestic law, and international court rulings have equal authority to the decisions of a representative government. Now, that's very significant, and I know he actually believes this, and he adheres to this school of thought, that international law is equal to or should take precedence over domestic law. Koh's transnational principles could have serious implications of the United States sovereignty, especially regarding the authorization of the use of force and the prosecution of the war on terror, gun rights, and abortion, and many, many other issues. Koh believes a nation who goes to war must have United Nations Security Council authority, going as far as writing that the United States was part of an axis of disobedience by invading Iraq, or should we say by liberating Iraq. In October of 2002, Koh wrote, and I'm quoting now, he said, "I believe that it would be a mistake for our country to attack Iraq without explicit UN authorization because such an attack would violate international law." Additionally, he supports ratification of the International Criminal Court, which could subject our troops to prosecution in a foreign court. Now, implementation of this interpretation of the international law raises a number of alarming questions. If the United States is required to gain UN authority for military action, what punitive actions might the United States be subjected to if it unilaterally uses preemptive force? Would our Navy SEALs have had to wait for authorization from the international body before rescuing the American being held hostage in the Horn of Africa? I think 99% of the American people said that they should have that authority, and we shouldn't have to go to any kind of an international court. I don't know where this obsession has come from, that nothing is good unless it's international anymore. In 1992, George Will said, and I'm quoting now, "There may come a time when the United States will be held hostage to the idea that the legitimacy of U.S. force is directly proportional to the number of nations condoning it." That was back in 1992, and this is what's happening today, and I hope that day never comes. The decisions made to protect our great nation should not be made by members of an international body, but by men and women who are elected by the people of these United States. Equally concerning is Koh's treatment toward the Department of Defense's recruiting efforts. In October of 2003, some of us remember this, Koh led a team of Yale Law faculty in filing an amicus brief in support of a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Defense, claiming the Solomon Amendment was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court rejected Koh's arguments unanimously. Now, that's a time when there are very few things that were unanimous in the United States Supreme Court. He was rejected unanimously. In writing for the court, Chief Justice Roberts stated, quote, "Nothing about recruiting suggests that law schools agree with any speech by recruiters, and nothing in the Solomon Amendment restricts what the law schools may say about the military's policies, unquote. And further, Koh supports accession to the International Criminal Court, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea Treaty, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Inter-American Convention against illicit manufacturing and trafficking of firearms. That's this thing, SIFTA, that's been promoted by President Obama. And that is that we yield to an international group in terms of how we manufacture and distribute weapons in this country. All of these treaties will greatly impact the lives of everyday Americans and will require the United States to alter its domestic law to meet their respective parameters. In 2002, Koh spoke at Fordham University Law School on a world drowning in guns. That's a quote, that's the name of it. Gives you an indication of where he's coming from. His speech was published in the Fordham Law Review. Koh's topic was the international arms trade, but as usual, his analysis had serious domestic implications. Koh wrote that American legal scholars should pursue the analysis and development of legal and policy arguments regarding international gun controls through constitutional research on the Second Amendment. In other words, Koh believes that the best way to regulate guns in America is through international law, through a global gun control regime. As legal advisor, Koh would be in a position to pass judgment on whether a proposed treaty would raise legal issues for the United States, including issues related to the Second Amendment. He would therefore be able to endorse treaties that could be used by the courts to restrict the individual right to keep and bear arms, an idea that he is clearly and openly in favor of. It is simply not true to say that his beliefs about gun control, this is what some people say, or the Second Amendment rights, doesn't really matter because he'll be in the State Department advising on international law. Well, on the contrary, he wants to use international law to restrict constitutional freedoms in this country. In his position, he will have the power to advise the administration and to testify before the Senate about what reservations might be needed when ratifying a treaty to protect constitutional freedoms. However, he has a history of advocating for treaties without conditions. He cannot be trusted to express reservations with treaties that I believe will negatively impact everyday Americans. The fact that he's in the State Department doesn't make him safe, it makes him more dangerous. This is exactly where, with the possible exception of the Supreme Court, he wants to be. This is not an accident. It is his strategy. He realizes he cannot achieve his goals through legislation, so he has turned to the international law. If he can establish that international law is binding on the United States, regardless of whether the Senate has ratified the treaty in question, activists can avoid Congress and work the issue through the courts. If you believe that the Second Amendment confers an individual right to bear arms on the American people, then I urge you to reaffirm that principle by voting against Harold Koh. And if you believe that our nation should be subjected by a variety of treaties that threaten our national sovereignty and American way of life, then I urge you to reaffirm those values by voting against the nominee. You know, I mentioned several things that the national treaties that he has promoted. And it's not just confined to our Second Amendment rights. It's everything else. The basis of his influence in these areas is that somehow international law should have precedence over our laws. This is something that we've been in trouble with for a long period of time. Every time we yield to the United Nations, we end up with a real serious problem. I've talked to a number of our troops overseas who are very much concerned about being subjected to the international court.